The morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport as Camilla, Queen Consort of England, walked through the private terminal with her usual grace. Her recent trip to Switzerland had been officially described as a wellness retreat, a much-needed break from the endless royal duties that filled her calendar. The press had been told she spent her time at a luxury spa, enjoying massages and meditation sessions away from the public eye. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Camilla's personal assistant, Margaret, wheeled her luggage behind her with careful precision. The black leather suitcases bore the royal crest as expected for any member of the royal family. What wasn't expected was the nervous energy that seemed to surround both women as they approached the customs area. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should use the diplomatic channel," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient airport noise. Camilla shook her head firmly. "No, we go through the regular process. We have nothing to hide." Her words were confident, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years. The customs officer, a middle-aged man named David Thompson, recognized her immediately. He had worked at Heathrow for 15 years and had seen countless celebrities and dignitaries pass through his checkpoint. But having the Queen Consort appear at his station was something entirely different. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he said with a respectful bow of his head. "Welcome back to England. I hope you had a pleasant journey." "Thank you, officer." "Yes, very refreshing," Camilla replied, her smile appearing genuine despite the tension that Margaret could sense radiating from her. David began the routine inspection, his movements careful and professional. Royal family members weren't typically subject to thorough searches, but recent security protocols required at least a basic check of all luggage, regardless of status. He opened the first suitcase, which contained exactly what he expected: elegant clothing, toiletries, and personal items that reflected the lifestyle of British royalty. The second suitcase appeared equally normal at first glance. Designer dresses hung neatly, shoes were arranged in protective bags, and jewelry boxes were secured in padded compartments. But as David moved aside a silk scarf, his hand touched something unexpected. Hidden beneath the clothing was a manila envelope, thick with contents and sealed with red wax. The seal bore no official markings that David could recognize, but something about it seemed significant. More concerning was the way Camilla's face had gone pale the moment his fingers found the envelope. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I need to examine this," David said, his training overriding any hesitation he might have felt about questioning royalty. "Of course, officer. Please do what you must," Camilla responded, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. As David carefully broke the wax seal, Margaret stepped forward. "Sir, I must inform you that this is private correspondence belonging to Her Majesty. Perhaps we could contact the palace security office." David paused, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. Royal correspondence was typically handled with extreme discretion, and he knew that opening it could have serious consequences for his career. But something in Camilla's expression told him that this wasn't ordinary royal business. The envelope contained photographs. As David glanced at the first image, his professional composure nearly faltered. The photograph showed a much younger Camilla, perhaps in her 30s, standing next to a man who was definitely not King Charles. They were in what appeared to be an intimate embrace, and the setting looked like a private residence rather than any official royal location. "Your Majesty," David said quietly. "I think we need to speak privately." Camilla nodded, her regal bearing intact despite the obvious stress of the situation. "Yes, I believe we do." As they moved to a private office within the customs area, Margaret remained with the luggage, her face a mask of professional calm despite the chaos she knew was about to unfold. She had worked for Camilla for over a decade, and she was aware of certain aspects of her employer's past that had never been made public. The private office was small and functional, designed for situations exactly like this one where discretion was paramount. David closed the door and offered Camilla a chair, which she accepted gratefully. "Your Majesty, I need to understand what these photographs represent," David began, his voice respectful but firm. "My job requires me to investigate anything that might be considered suspicious or potentially compromising to national security." Camilla took a deep breath, her years of experience in handling difficult situations coming to her aid. "Officer Thompson, What you've discovered relates to a period of my life that occurred many years ago, long before my marriage to the then Prince Charles. I was a different person then, making different choices. Can you tell me about the man in the photographs? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla looked out the small window of the office, watching planes taxi on the runway beyond. Each moment of silence seemed to stretch into eternity. His name was Alessandro Benedetti, she finally said. He was an Italian businessman I met during a trip to Rome in the early 1980s. We had a brief relationship that ended when I realized the implications it could have for my future. David nodded, making notes on a pad. And why were you carrying these photographs now? After all these years? Camilla's composure cracked slightly. Because Alessandro contacted me recently. He's dying of cancer and he wanted me to have them as a reminder of what we shared. He assured me that no copies exist, that these were the only evidence of our time together. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He understood immediately why these photographs could be so dangerous. The British royal family had survived numerous scandals over the years, but the current stability of the monarchy depended heavily on public perception of legitimacy and moral authority. Your Majesty, do you believe these photographs could be used to damage the reputation of the royal family? Camilla met his gaze directly. Officer Thompson, I believe these photographs, in the wrong hands, could destroy everything my husband and I have worked to build over the past 20 years. The weight of the moment settled over both of them. David realized that he was holding not just photographs, but potentially the future of the British monarchy in his hands. David Thompson stared at the photographs spread across his desk, each image more compromising than the last. The customs office felt smaller with each passing minute as the magnitude of his discovery became clear. Across from him, Camilla sat with the poise that had been drilled into her through decades of royal training, but he could see the fear flickering in her eyes. Your Majesty, I need to understand the full scope of this situation, David said, his voice gentle but professional. Were there any other materials exchanged with Mr. Benedetti? Camilla hesitated, her fingers worrying the clasp of her handbag. There were letters, personal letters that we wrote to each other during our time together. Alessandro told me he destroyed them years ago, but... She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging. But you're not certain? No, I'm not certain. The admission seemed to cost her greatly. Alessandro was always sentimental. He kept mementos from important moments in his life. Our relationship, brief as it was, meant a great deal to him. David examined one of the photographs more closely. The timestamp in the corner showed it was taken in March 1983, just months before Camilla's engagement to Andrew Parker Bowles became public knowledge. The implications were staggering. Your Majesty, did Prince Charles know about this relationship? Camilla's silence stretched for nearly a minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Charles and I weren't together at that time. We had ended our relationship years earlier, when he was expected to marry someone more suitable. I was free to see whomever I chose. But he doesn't know about Alessandro. No. The single word carried the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets. Charles has always been a romantic at heart. He idealized our early relationship, our separation, and our eventual reunion. Learning about Alessandro would devastate him, not because of jealousy, but because it would shatter his vision of our love story. David nodded, beginning to understand the complex web of emotions and expectations that surrounded the royal marriage. And if these photographs became public? Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. Officer Thompson, you have to understand something about the British people's relationship with their royal family. They forgave Charles and me for our affair during his marriage to Diana eventually. They accepted our marriage gradually. But this would be seen as proof that I was never worthy of becoming queen consort. She stood and walked to the small window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. The press would paint me as a woman who was unfaithful not just to marriage vows but to Charles himself. They would say I was carrying on with other men while maintaining my relationship with the future king. But that's not accurate, is it? Accuracy has never been a requirement for destroying a royal reputation, Camilla replied bitterly. The truth is complex, messy, and human. The public prefers their scandals simple and their villains clearly defined. David looked at his watch. They had been in the private office for over an hour, and he knew that prolonged delays would eventually attract attention from his supervisors. More concerning was the fact that Margaret was still waiting outside with the luggage. and airport security protocols would soon require additional personnel to be involved. Your Majesty, what exactly are you asking of me? Camilla turned from the window, her royal bearing reasserting itself. I'm asking you to consider what would be best for the country. These photographs serve no purpose now except to cause pain and instability. Alessandro is dying and our relationship ended 40 years ago. Nothing can be gained by their existence except destruction. The request hung in the air between them. David understood that he was being asked to make a decision that went far beyond his duties as a customs officer. He was being asked to make a choice that could affect the stability of the British government itself. There's something else, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger. Alessandro didn't just send photographs. He sent a message. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded it and placed it on the desk between them. David read the handwritten note, which was in English despite Alessandro's Italian heritage. My dearest Camilla, I have watched your life unfold from afar with great pride and some sadness. You became the woman I always knew you could be. But I wonder sometimes if you remember the woman you were with me. I am dying, and I wanted you to have these memories of when we were both free to love without considering kingdoms or crowns. I have told no one of our time together, and I never will. These photographs are my gift to you, and my secret dies with me, with all my love and respect for what you have become, Alessandro. The letter changed everything. David could see that this wasn't an attempt at blackmail or public embarrassment. It was a dying man's attempt to give closure to a woman he had loved 4 decades earlier. He really loved you, David said softly. Yes, he did, and I loved him. For a brief, wonderful moment in time when I thought I could be someone other than who I was destined to become. Tears had formed in Camilla's eyes, but she maintained her composure. Your Majesty, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you believe that destroying these photographs would be in the best interest of the United Kingdom? Camilla considered the question carefully. I believe that these photographs, if made public, would cause a constitutional crisis at a time when the country needs stability. King Charles is still new to the throne, and the monarchy's approval ratings, while stable, are not unshakable. A scandal of this magnitude could provide ammunition for Republican movements that seek to abolish the monarchy altogether. David realized that his decision would have implications far beyond the immediate situation. The British monarchy, while largely ceremonial, still played a crucial role in the country's international relationships and domestic stability. A major scandal could affect everything from tourism revenue to diplomatic relations. There's one more thing I need to know, he said. How can I be certain that no other copies of these photographs exist? Camilla pulled out her phone and showed him a text message received just hours earlier. It was from a number with an Italian country code. The package has been delivered. As promised, no copies remain. You were the love of my youth, and that secret is safe. Goodbye, my dear friend. The timestamp showed that the message had been sent at 3:47 a.m. Italian time, suggesting that Alessandro had stayed awake through the night to ensure she received confirmation. He sent this just after I collected the package in Switzerland, Camilla explained. Alessandro is many things, but he has never been a liar. If he says no copies exist, then none exist. David looked again at the photographs, then at the letter, then at the woman who had become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He was faced with a decision that no training course had prepared him for. A choice between duty to regulations and duty to something larger than himself. David Thompson had been a customs officer for 15 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moral complexity of the situation facing him now. The photographs lay scattered across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, could reshape British history. Camilla sat across from him, her royal composure intact but her humanity clearly visible in the way her fingers trembled as she reached for her teacup. Officer Thompson, she said quietly, I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to break the law. If you feel that your duty requires you to report this discovery, I will accept the consequences. David studied her face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was a woman who had spent decades learning to carry burdens that would crush most people, now facing the possibility that one carefully guarded secret could undo a lifetime of service. Your Majesty, can you help me understand something? Why didn't you simply destroy these photographs yourself when you received them? Camilla's smile was sad and complicated. Because Alessandro asked me not to. In his letter, which you didn't see, he requested that I keep them for at least one day to remember what we shared before deciding their fate. He said that our love deserved at least that much recognition, even if it could never be public. She paused, looking down at her hands. I realize how that must sound to someone who doesn't know the full story. But you have to understand that Alessandro and I shared something genuine during a time when I believed my life with Charles was permanently over. Those months in 1983 were perhaps the only time in my adult life when I was allowed to be completely myself, without considering the expectations of the royal family or British society. David found himself moved by her honesty. And now? Now I've had my day to remember. Alessandro died this morning at 6:30 a.m. Italian time. I received the call just before we landed. Her voice broke slightly as she shared this information. These photographs are all that remains of a man who loved me without condition and never asked for anything in return except to be remembered kindly. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Alessandro Benedetti was dead, taking with him any possibility that additional evidence of the relationship could surface. But it also meant that Camilla was dealing with fresh grief while facing the potential destruction of her public life. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said genuinely. "Thank you. Alessandro lived a full life. He married a wonderful woman, raised 3 children, and built a successful business in Milan. But he told me once that his time with me taught him how to love completely, and that knowledge helped him become the man his family deserved." David looked again at the photographs, trying to see them not as potential weapons against the monarchy, but as evidence of a love affair that had shaped 2 people's lives 4 decades earlier. In the images, Camilla looked genuinely happy in a way that was different from her public smiles. There was freedom in her expression, a lightness that he had never seen in any official royal photograph. "Your Majesty, if these photographs were to disappear, how would you explain that to yourself? Would you see it as a betrayal of Alessandro's memory?" Camilla considered the question carefully. Alessandro's memory lives in the impact he had on people who knew him, not in photographs that could cause harm to others. He would understand that sometimes love requires sacrifice, including the sacrifice of physical reminders. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the office door. David's supervisor, Patricia Wells, entered after he called for her to come in. Patricia was a veteran of the customs service, known for her strict adherence to regulations and her inability to be intimidated by celebrity or status. "David, we have a situation," she said, noticing Camilla for the first time. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption." "Not at all," Camilla replied gracefully. "Officer Thompson has been most professional." Patricia looked at the photograph still visible on David's desk, her expression immediately becoming serious. "David, I need to speak with you privately." "Ma'am, I think it would be appropriate for Her Majesty to remain," David said, surprising himself with his boldness. "This concerns her directly." Patricia hesitated, then closed the door behind her. "Your Majesty, I'm going to speak frankly. Word has reached airport security that there's been an extended delay in your customs processing. They're asking questions, and within the hour, this situation will escalate beyond our ability to handle it quietly." Camilla nodded, understanding the implications. "Ms. Wells, what would normally happen in a situation like this?" "Normally, any suspicious materials found during customs inspection would be photographed, cataloged, and forwarded to the appropriate authorities for investigation. In the case of materials potentially related to national security or royal family security, MI5 would become involved within hours." The mention of MI5 changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. David realized that his decision was no longer just about personal ethics or even royal reputation. Once the intelligence services became involved, the photographs would enter a system where Camilla would have no control over their eventual disposition or use. "However," Patricia continued, "there are provisions in our protocols for materials that are determined to pose no actual security risk. If the senior customs officer determines that items are personal in nature and present no threat, they can be returned to the traveler without further documentation." David looked at his supervisor with new understanding. Patricia was offering him a way out. A legitimate path that would allow him to make the decision he was already leaning toward. "The question is," Patricia said, looking directly at David, "whether these materials present any genuine security risk to the United Kingdom or its institutions." David picked up one of the photographs, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. In my professional opinion, these appear to be personal photographs of a private relationship that occurred 40 years ago. The individual in question is deceased, and there are no indications of any ongoing security concerns. Patricia nodded approvingly. And what is your recommendation regarding their disposition? I recommend that these personal effects be returned to their owner immediately, with no further documentation required. Camilla's relief was visible, but she maintained her composure as Patricia gathered the photographs and placed them back in their envelope. Your Majesty, Patricia said, I believe this concludes our customs inspection. I apologize for any inconvenience. Not at all. You've both been most professional. Camilla accepted the envelope, holding it carefully. Thank you for your service to the country. As they prepared to leave the office, David found himself wondering if he had made the right choice. Patricia seemed to sense his uncertainty. David, she said quietly, sometimes our job is not just to enforce regulations, but to consider what enforcement serves. Today you serve the greater good. Camilla paused at the door. Officer Thompson, I want you to know that your discretion today will not be forgotten. If there's ever anything the palace can do to show our appreciation for your service, no need, Your Majesty, just take care of yourself. As they walked back through the customs area, Margaret looked up with obvious relief. She had spent the past 2 hours maintaining a calm exterior, while internally panicking about the potential consequences of discovery. Everything resolved, Your Majesty? Yes, Margaret. Everything is exactly as it should be. As Camilla's car pulled away from Heathrow Airport, she sat in the back seat with the envelope in her lap. Through the tinted windows, she watched London pass by, thinking about Alessandro's final gift and the customs officer, who had chosen compassion over protocol. She would never know that David spent the rest of his shift questioning whether he had acted appropriately, or that Patricia had made a note in his personnel file commending him for exceptional judgment in a sensitive situation involving national interests. The drive from Heathrow to Clarence House took 45 minutes through London traffic, giving Camilla time to process what had just happened. The envelope containing Alessandro's photographs sat beside her, and with each mile that passed, she felt the weight of the secret growing heavier. Margaret sat across from her, maintaining professional silence while clearly dying to ask questions about the extended customs delay. Your Majesty, Margaret finally ventured, should I adjust your schedule for this afternoon? You seem thoughtful. Camilla smiled at her assistant's careful choice of words. Margaret had worked for the royal household long enough to know that thoughtful was code for emotionally exhausted. Actually, Margaret, I think I'd like to spend some time in the garden when we arrive. Could you cancel my tea with the Duchess of Cornwall Foundation Board? Tell them I'm feeling slightly unwell from travel. Of course, Your Majesty. And your evening engagement with the Prince of Wales? The mention of Charles made Camilla's stomach tighten. In a few hours, she would be sitting across from her husband at dinner, making conversation about her trip to Switzerland while hiding the most significant event that had happened to her in years. No, don't cancel that. Charles is looking forward to hearing about my retreat. When they arrived at Clarence House, Camilla went directly to her private study, a room that had become her sanctuary over the years. The walls were lined with books, photographs of family members, and mementos from her various charitable endeavors. It was here that she handled her most personal correspondence and made her most difficult decisions. She placed Alessandro's envelope on her desk and stared at it for several minutes. Through the window, she could see the garden where she and Charles often took their morning coffee, where they had planned their wedding, where they had weathered numerous storms together over the years. The photographs inside the envelope represented a version of herself that had existed before she became fully committed to royal life. That woman had been free to love without considering constitutional implications, free to make choices based purely on emotion rather than duty. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Charles. Darling, hope the flight went well. Looking forward to hearing about your spa adventures over dinner. The roses in the garden are particularly beautiful today. Love, see? The simple message, so typical of Charles's romantic nature, made her eyes well with tears. Her husband's capacity for finding beauty in everyday moments was one of the things she loved most about him. It was also what made the secret she was carrying so painful. Camilla opened the envelope and looked at the photographs one more time. In them, she saw a woman she barely remembered being, carefree, laughing, completely absorbed in the moment with someone who loved her without reservation. Alessandro had captured not just images but a feeling that she had almost forgotten existed. But as she studied the photographs, she also saw something else. She saw a woman who, despite being happy in that moment, had still been searching for something more. The love she had shared with Alessandro had been genuine, but it had also been temporary, a beautiful interlude rather than a lasting foundation. Her love with Charles had been the opposite, complicated, sometimes painful, often interrupted but ultimately enduring. They had hurt each other, disappointed each other, and caused pain to others along the way, but they had also grown together, learned to put duty alongside desire, and built something that had lasted through decades of public scrutiny. She reached for her private phone and dialed a number she had memorized years earlier, but had never used. It rang several times before a woman answered in accented English. "Pronto? Who is this?" "Mrs. Benedetti, this is Camilla Parker Bowles. I believe you know why I'm calling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Your Majesty." "Yes, Alessandro told me you might call after he was gone. I wanted to express my condolences for your loss. Alessandro was a wonderful man. Thank you. He spoke of you often, especially in recent months. He said you had taught him how to love completely, and that lesson made him a better husband to me and father to our children." Camilla felt her throat tighten. "He said something similar to me. Mrs. Benedetti, I hope you know that what Alessandro and I shared never diminished what he felt for his family. I know. Alessandro was a man who loved deeply and completely, but he understood the difference between a moment of love and a lifetime of love. What you gave him was beautiful, but what we built together was lasting." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, two women sharing memories of a man they had both loved, each in her own way. By the end of the call, Camilla felt something she hadn't expected: peace. That evening, Charles arrived at Clarence's house with a small bouquet of roses from the garden, and his usual enthusiasm for hearing about her travels. "Darling, you look wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek. "The Swiss air obviously agreed with you." They settled in the sitting room with glasses of wine, and Charles listened attentively as Camilla described her spa treatments, the mountain views, and the peaceful routine she had enjoyed. She found herself being more honest than she had expected, talking about how the time away had given her perspective on their life together. "I realized something while I was there," she said, curling up beside him on the sofa. "I realized how incredibly grateful I am for what we have, Charles. For the life we've built together, despite all the complications and challenges." Charles smiled, his eyes crinkling in the way that had first attracted her to him decades earlier. "That's a lovely sentiment, but what brought it on? You sound almost reflective." "I suppose I am. Being away from everything, from the responsibilities and the schedules, made me think about choices, about paths taken and paths not taken." "And are you happy with the paths we've taken?" Camilla looked at her husband, seeing in his face the young man she had fallen in love with, the middle-aged man who had struggled with duty and desire, and the king he had become. Their love story had never been simple or perfect, but it had been real and lasting. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy with our path." Later that night, after Charles had returned to his own residence, Camilla went back to her study. The envelope was still on her desk, but now she knew what she needed to do with it. She built a small fire in the fireplace, something she rarely did except in the depths of winter. One by one, she fed Alessandro's photographs into the flames, watching as the images of her younger self dissolved into ash. With each photograph, she said a small prayer of gratitude for the love she had received and the lessons she had learned. The last thing she burned was Alessandro's letter. As the paper caught fire, she spoke aloud to the empty room. "Thank you, Alessandro, for loving me completely when I needed it most. Thank you for keeping our secret safe. And thank you for helping me understand the difference between a beautiful moment and a beautiful life." The flames died down, leaving only ashes in the grate. Camilla swept them into a small garden pot and carried it outside to her rose garden. In the moonlight, she scattered the ashes among the flowers that Charles had mentioned in his text message earlier. As she stood in the garden, she felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced in years. The secret that had threatened to destroy everything she had built was now truly gone. transformed from dangerous evidence into nourishment for something beautiful and lasting. She would never tell Charles about Alessandro or about what had happened at the airport. Some secrets, she realized, were meant to be carried alone, not because they were shameful, but because they were complete in themselves and required no validation or forgiveness from others. Walking back into the house, Camilla felt lighter than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring the usual round of royal duties, public appearances, and ceremonial obligations. But tonight she was simply a woman who had loved and been loved, who had made difficult choices and lived with their consequences, and who had finally found peace with the path she had chosen. 3 weeks after the airport incident, life had returned to its normal rhythm for Camilla, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The secret she had carried for so many years was gone, destroyed in the flames of her fireplace. Yet she found herself thinking about Alessandro, and that distant time in her life more than she had in decades. David Thompson had returned to his regular duties at Heathrow, processing the usual stream of travelers, celebrities, and dignitaries, but the encounter with Camilla had left him questioning many of his assumptions about duty, loyalty, and the complex decisions that people in positions of authority must make every day. On this particular Tuesday morning, David was working the morning shift when his supervisor, Patricia Wells, approached his station with an unusual expression on her face. "David, there's someone here to see you," she said quietly. Someone from the palace. David felt his stomach drop. Had someone discovered what had happened 3 weeks earlier? Had he made a mistake that was only now coming to light? Following Patricia to the administrative offices, David found himself face to face with a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself as Sir Michael Stevens, the keeper of the privy purse. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for agreeing to see me," Sir Michael said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "I'm here on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen Consort regarding an incident that occurred recently during her return from Switzerland." David's mouth went dry. "Sir, I followed all proper protocols during that inspection." Sir Michael held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Thompson, you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. Her Majesty specifically asked me to commend you for your professionalism and discretion during what was obviously a sensitive situation." Relief flooded through David, but he remained cautious. "I was simply doing my job, sir." "Yes, but you did it with wisdom and compassion, qualities that are sometimes more important than strict adherence to regulations." Sir Michael opened a leather portfolio and removed an official-looking document. "The palace would like to recognize your service with a commendation letter for your personnel file, and with a small token of appreciation." The commendation letter was signed by Camilla herself and spoke of David's exceptional discretion and professional judgment in handling sensitive matters relating to royal security and privacy. Accompanying it was an invitation to a private reception at St. James's Palace for individuals who had provided exemplary service to the royal household. "Sir, this is very generous, but I'm not sure it's necessary," David said, still processing the unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Thompson, sometimes in life we face moments that test not just our professional competence but our character. Her Majesty believes you demonstrated exceptional character, and she wanted that to be recognized appropriately." After Sir Michael left, David sat in the break room holding the commendation letter and trying to understand how his split-second decision had led to recognition from the palace itself. Patricia found him there 20 minutes later, staring at the official document. "David, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I'm beginning to understand that what happened that day was bigger than I realized," he said slowly. Meanwhile, at Clarence's house, Camilla was dealing with her own unexpected consequences from the airport incident. Margaret had been increasingly attentive over the past few weeks, clearly sensing that something significant had happened during their return from Switzerland. "Your Majesty," Margaret said during their daily schedule review, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but you've seemed different since we returned from your retreat. More peaceful, if I may say so." Camilla looked up from the correspondence she was reviewing, considering how to respond to her assistant's observation. "Margaret, you've worked for me for a long time. Have you ever had a secret that felt too heavy to carry?" Margaret's expression softened. "Yes, ma'am. I think most people have. And have you ever found that the weight of keeping a secret was actually heavier than the secret itself?" "I have, Your Majesty." Sometimes the fear of discovery is worse than whatever we're trying to hide. Camilla nodded thoughtfully. I had an experience recently that helped me understand the difference between secrets that protect others and secrets that imprison ourselves. She didn't elaborate further, but Margaret seemed to understand that some kind of resolution had taken place during their extended time in the customs office. That evening, Charles noticed the change in his wife as well. They were walking through the gardens after dinner, a ritual they had maintained for years, when he commented on her demeanor. Camilla, you've seemed remarkably content lately, almost radiant if I may say so. The Swiss retreat obviously did you a world of good. Camilla took his arm, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence beside her. Charles, do you ever think about the roads we didn't take? The different lives we might have lived? Charles considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something meaningful. Sometimes, but I've learned that wondering about alternative paths is usually less productive than appreciating the path we chose. Even with all the complications, all the pain we caused along the way? Especially because of the complications, Charles replied. Easy love doesn't teach you anything. Difficult love, love that requires sacrifice and growth and forgiveness, that teaches you who you really are. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point in their lives. Charles, Camilla said finally, I want you to know how grateful I am for your patience with me over the years, for your willingness to wait, to forgive, to build something lasting despite all the obstacles. Charles stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. Camilla, what's brought this on? You're talking as if you're processing something significant. She looked at her husband, seeing in his face all the qualities that had made her fall in love with him. His sincerity, his capacity for deep feeling, his commitment to duty balanced with his very human need for love and understanding. I suppose I am processing something, she said. I'm processing how lucky we are to have found each other again after all these years. How remarkable it is that we've built something good and lasting despite all the reasons it should have failed. Charles kissed her forehead gently. We've built something good because we both learned that love isn't just about passion or desire. It's about choice, choosing each other every day even when it's difficult. Later that night, as Camilla prepared for bed, she thought about Charles' words about choice. She had chosen Alessandro for a brief, passionate moment when she was young, and believed her future with Charles was impossible. She had chosen Charles when maturity taught her the difference between momentary happiness and lasting fulfillment. And she had chosen to protect their marriage by destroying evidence of that earlier choice, not because she was ashamed of having loved Alessandro, but because she understood that some chapters of our lives are meant to remain private, not because they're wrong, but because they're complete. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the garden where she had scattered Alessandro's ashes among the roses, Camilla felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned something valuable from the crisis at the airport. The power of secrets lies not in keeping them, but in knowing when and how to let them go. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities to choose between competing goods. But tonight, she was content knowing that she had handled this particular test with wisdom and grace, protecting not just her own reputation, but the stability of an institution that millions of people depended on for continuity and hope. The secret that had threatened to destroy everything was now nourishing the roses that her husband tended with such care. In that transformation, Camilla found a perfect metaphor for the way love, properly understood, can transform even our most difficult experiences into something beautiful and life-giving. 2 months after the airport incident, the invitation to the private reception at St. James's Palace arrived at David Thompson's modest flat in South London. He had almost forgotten about the commendation from Sir Michael Stevens, having returned to his routine of processing travelers and dealing with the usual customs situations that arose at Heathrow. The reception was scheduled for a Thursday evening, described as an informal gathering to recognize individuals who have provided exceptional service to the royal household. David's wife, Sarah, was more excited about the invitation than he was. David, you're going to meet the Queen Consort personally, she said, holding the elegant invitation card. What exactly did you do to earn this kind of recognition? David had told Sarah only that he had handled a sensitive customs matter involving Camilla, without providing any specific details. The weight of keeping the secret had been surprisingly manageable, mainly because he was confident he had made the right choice. "I just did my job. Sarah, sometimes that's enough." On the evening of the reception, David found himself standing in the elegant surroundings of St. James's Palace, wearing his best suit and feeling completely out of place among the assembled guests. There were perhaps 50 people present: civil servants, security personnel, charity workers, and others who had apparently provided various services to the royal family. Camilla moved through the room with practiced grace, speaking personally with each guest. David watched her from across the room, marveling at her ability to make each person feel as though their contribution was significant and valued. When she finally approached him, David felt his heart rate increase despite himself. "Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, extending her hand, "I'm so pleased you could join us this evening. Your Majesty, thank you for the invitation. This is quite an honor." "The honor is mine," she replied, her tone sincere. "What you did that day at the airport demonstrated exactly the kind of wisdom and compassion that makes our country strong." They moved to a quieter corner of the room, away from the other guests and conversations. "I hope you know," Camilla continued, "that your decision that day probably prevented a crisis that could have had far-reaching consequences. Not just for me personally, but for the institution I represent." David nodded, understanding more fully now the magnitude of what had been at stake. "Your Majesty, may I ask how things have worked out since then?" Camilla's smile became more personal, less formal. "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson, the most difficult decisions we make turn out to be the most liberating. I found a piece I didn't know I was missing, and the materials in question? They served their purpose and then found a more appropriate resting place," she said simply. "Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to let it go." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles, who had been circulating among the other guests. David felt a moment of panic, wondering if the king knew about his role in the airport incident. "Darling," Charles said to Camilla, "I hope you're not monopolizing Mr. Thompson's time." "Actually, Your Majesty," David said, finding his voice. "Her Majesty was just expressing her appreciation for some assistance I provided during a customs inspection." Charles smiled warmly. "Ah, yes. Sir Michael mentioned that you had handled a sensitive situation with exceptional discretion. The royal family deeply appreciates professionals who understand that sometimes duty extends beyond simple rule-following." David realized that Charles knew something about the incident, though perhaps not the specific details. The king's words suggested an understanding that complex situations sometimes required nuanced judgments. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I was simply trying to serve the best interest of the country." "Exactly right," Charles replied. "That's the kind of thinking that keeps our institution strong." As the evening progressed, David found himself in conversations with other guests who had their own stories of serving the royal family in various capacities. A security officer who had once quietly prevented a potentially embarrassing incident involving a visiting dignitary. A housekeeper who had discovered and discreetly handled some sensitive correspondence that had been misplaced. A driver who had navigated a family crisis with exceptional care and confidentiality. David began to understand that he was part of a network of individuals who, in small ways and large, helped maintain the stability and dignity of the monarchy through their individual acts of judgment and discretion. Near the end of the evening, Patricia Wells, his supervisor, approached him with a knowing smile. "David, I see you've been having some interesting conversations this evening." "Patricia, I'm beginning to understand that what happened that day was part of something much larger than I realized. The monarchy survives not just because of grand ceremonies and constitutional law," Patricia said quietly, "but because of individual people making good decisions in difficult moments. You made a very good decision that day." As the reception was winding down, Camilla made a brief speech to the assembled guests. "Each of you," she said, "has contributed to something that extends far beyond any individual person or moment. You've helped preserve an institution that provides stability and continuity for millions of people. More importantly, you've demonstrated that duty and compassion are not opposing forces but complementary ones." Her eyes found David's across the room as she continued. "Sometimes we face situations where the right choice is not the obvious choice, where wisdom requires us to look beyond immediate rules to larger principles. Thank you for having the courage to make those difficult decisions. As David and Sarah left the palace that evening, walking through the historic streets of London, David felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the recognition he had received. "Sarah," he said as they waited for their bus, "I think I understand something now about service that I never understood before." "What's that?" "Real service isn't just about following procedures or even following orders. It's about understanding what you're really serving and being willing to make difficult choices to protect it up." The bus ride home gave David time to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a routine customs inspection and led to an evening at the palace. But more than the recognition or the elegant reception, he was struck by the realization that his moment of moral uncertainty had been shared by many others in similar positions. The next morning at Heathrow, David returned to his normal duties with a new perspective on his role. He was not just enforcing customs regulations or processing travelers. He was part of a larger system of individuals who, through their daily decisions, helped maintain the institutions that held society together. When Patricia assigned him to the diplomatic terminal later that week, David approached the work with a new understanding of its importance. Each inspection was an opportunity not just to enforce rules, but to serve something larger than himself. And when he encountered situations that required judgment beyond simple rule following, he thought of Camilla's words about duty and compassion being complementary forces, and of Charles's observation that sometimes duty extends beyond simple rule following to encompass a larger understanding of service to country and institution. The secret he carried about the photographs would remain with him, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a badge of trust, evidence that he had been worthy of making a decision that mattered not just to two individuals, but to the stability of the nation itself. 1 year after the airport incident, Camilla found herself in her garden on a crisp autumn morning, tending to the roses where she had scattered Alessandro's ashes. The flowers had bloomed magnificently throughout the summer, more vibrant than they had ever been before, as if nourished by the secret that had finally found peace. Charles joined her in the garden, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression that had become more common in recent months. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," he observed, settling onto the bench beside her. "Whatever you did to them seems to have agreed with them tremendously." Camilla accepted her coffee and smiled at the innocent accuracy of his observation. "Sometimes things grow better when they're fed by experiences that have been properly processed and put to rest." Charles looked at her with the mixture of love and curiosity that characterized many of their conversations after nearly 20 years of marriage. "You've been quite philosophical lately, darling. Almost mystical in your observations about gardening and growth. Perhaps I'm finally old enough to understand the difference between things that should be preserved and things that should be transformed," she replied. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the morning light play across the garden they had created together over the years. Each plant, each pathway, each carefully chosen element represented a decision they had made as a couple, building something beautiful from the ground up. "Camilla," Charles said eventually, "I hope you know how proud I am of the woman you've become. Not just as queen consort, but as my partner and companion. You've grown into someone who handles difficult situations with such grace and wisdom." His words carried more weight than he could possibly know. Over the past year, Camilla had faced numerous challenges that required the same kind of judgment she had exercised with Alessandro's photographs. Decisions about which royal traditions to maintain and which to modernize. Choices about how to respond to criticism from the press. Questions about how much of their private life to share with the public and how much to keep sacred. In each case, she found herself applying the lessons she had learned from that crisis at the airport. The importance of considering long-term consequences over immediate comfort, the value of protecting institutions while remaining human, and the wisdom of knowing when to hold on to the past and when to let it go. "Charles," she said, "do you remember what you said about love being a choice? About choosing each other every day?" "Of course. It's become one of my fundamental beliefs about marriage. I've been thinking about that in broader terms lately, about how we choose not just our partners but our principles, how we decide what kind of people we want to be when faced with difficult decisions." Charles set down his coffee cup and took her hand. You sound as if you've been tested in some way recently. Camilla squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his touch. We're all tested regularly, aren't we? Every day brings choices that reveal who we really are underneath our public roles. And what do you think your choices reveal about who you are? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities for confession or revelation. Camilla considered all the ways she could answer, all the truth she could share and all the secrets she could continue to protect. I think they reveal someone who has learned to balance personal desires with larger responsibilities. Someone who understands that sometimes love means protecting others from unnecessary pain, even when that protection requires personal sacrifice. Charles nodded approvingly. That sounds like the definition of wisdom to me. Later that afternoon, Camilla received an unexpected phone call from Italy. It was Alessandro's widow, Mrs. Benedetti, calling to inform her that Alessandro's estate had been settled and his house in Milan was being prepared for sale. Your Majesty, Mrs. Benedetti said in her careful English, I found something while clearing out Alessandro's study that I thought you should know about. Camilla felt her heart skip a beat. Had there been other photographs? Other evidence of their relationship that Alessandro had forgotten to mention? Alessandro kept a diary throughout his life, Mrs. Benedetti continued. In the entries from 1983, he wrote extensively about his time with you. But he also wrote about his decision to keep that time private, and his reasons for doing so. What did he say? He wrote that loving you had taught him the difference between possessive love and generous love. Possessive love seeks to own and control. Generous love seeks to protect and elevate. He said that his love for you was generous and that generous love sometimes requires sacrifice and silence. Camilla felt tears forming in her eyes. Even decades after their brief relationship, Alessandro was still teaching her about the nature of love. Mrs. Benedetti, what did you do with the diary? I burned it, Your Majesty. Alessandro's generous love deserved to be honored, not exposed. Some gifts are meant to remain private between the giver and the receiver. After the call ended, Camilla sat in her study thinking about Alessandro's definition of generous love. It was, she realized, in perfect description of what she had shared not only with Alessandro, but ultimately with Charles as well. The love that had sustained their marriage through decades of challenge and change had been generous love, protective, elevating, sometimes requiring sacrifice, but ultimately focused on the well-being of the beloved, rather than the satisfaction of the lover. That evening, as she and Charles were reviewing their schedules for the following week, Camilla found herself looking at her husband with fresh appreciation. Charles, do you think we've been good for each other? Overall, despite all the complications? Charles looked up from his correspondence with surprise at the unexpected question. Camilla, we've been extraordinary for each other. We've both become better people because of our relationship, even when it was difficult. How so? You've taught me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real and lasting. That patience and forgiveness can create something stronger than passion alone. And I hope I've taught you that you're worthy of being loved completely. Despite what others might say or think, his words were so close to what Alessandro had written in his final letter that Camilla felt the universe was providing confirmation of choices she had made across the decades. Yes, she said simply. We've been very good for each other. As winter approached and the roses in their garden prepared for dormancy, Camilla reflected on the full cycle of growth, bloom, rest, and renewal that characterized both gardens and lives. The secret that had once threatened to destroy everything had been transformed into something that nourished new growth. David Thompson continued his work at Heathrow, now serving occasionally as a trainer for new customs officers. In his training sessions, he emphasized the importance of good judgment and the understanding that their role extended beyond simple rule enforcement to service of larger principles. Alessandro's memory lived on in the roses that bloomed each summer, in the love his widow continued to feel for him, and in the lesson he had taught about generous love that continued to guide Camilla's decisions as queen consort. And in the end, the story that could have destroyed a monarchy instead became a private testimony to the power of wise choices, generous love, and the understanding that some secrets are best honored not by exposure, but by transformation into something beautiful and life-giving. The photographs were gone, burned to ash and scattered among flowers. But the love they represented, properly understood and gracefully released, continued to bloom in the garden of a marriage that had learned to transform even its most difficult chapters into sources of wisdom and strength.